The communist challenge is not new. This is South Vietnam. In the years after 1946, French forces struggled to maintain their influence against the tide of communist-led Vietnamese forces pressing from the north.
The French army had been in Indochina since the middle of the 19th century. The regular army and the legendary legionnaires exerted its considerable power to enforce the authority of the colonial government, extinguishing countless acts of rebellion intended to destabilize the French hold on the region. That grip began to loosen in May of 1940 when Hitler unleashed upon the Low Countries and France Blitzkrieg.
For the Führer, this was the greatest prize he had yet captured. In a matter of days, the German army was rolling through the French countryside toward Paris. Germany's traditional enemy now lay at the feet of the gloating Nazi Superman.
After 6 weeks of fighting, the British Army was thrown into the sea. France, under World War I hero General Henri-Philippe Pétain, signed an armistice in the same train where Germany was forced to lay down its arms in 1918. Pétain was the head of French government in southern France, wholly dependent on and collaborating with Germany. Early in 1940, Ho Chi Minh returned from Paris to Vietnam to become the leading figure in the Indochinese Communist Party and its military arm, the Viet Minh. This military force was formed to fight the French troops in Southeast Asia, but soon was confronted by another, more dangerous foe.
Out of this meeting between two unscrupulous warrior nations, bent on destruction of the existing world, came an agreement that Germany would not interfere with Japan's designs on Indochina and Thailand.
On August 30th, 1940, the Matsuoka-Henry Pact was signed by the puppet Vichy government and the Empire of Japan. This pact permitted the Japanese to station troops in French Indochina. The French colonial administration now was merely window dressing for the Japanese army. To Ho Chi Minh, it made no difference as to who the occupying army was. They were still forcing their rule upon his people. Ho had preached national independence, and now was the time for his nationalist army to strike a blow for that independence. With the help of arms from the U.S. and training support from the Office of Strategic Services, better known as the OSS, he invited all the region's revolutionary forces to unite under his command in the fight against the occupying armies of Japan and France. For 3 bloody years, Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam led a no-holds-barred fight against the Japanese in Southeast Asia. The death toll on both sides was appalling. Far away from the jungle battles, a death blow was struck against the Japanese Empire that brought the fighting to an end. On September 3rd, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, Japan surrenders to the Allies. But even before the ink was dry on the surrender document, the groundwork for a new conflict was being laid in Southeast Asia. As the Japanese troops in Vietnam are laying down their arms, Ho Chi Minh takes advantage of the power vacuum left by the defeated Imperial Army. He proclaims himself to be the only political authority for the nation and creates the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But the French have other ideas. In Paris, General Charles de Gaulle, anxious to restore French sovereignty in Indochina, sends a 70,000-man expeditionary corps under the command of General Philippe Francois-Marie Leclerc to regain control of the Asian colony. Leclerc makes some effort to compromise with Ho Chi Minh, but in the end, the Viet Minh once again pick up arms and the long war in Vietnam begins. For 160 years, they fought for France in places most Frenchmen would like to forget. At one time, an army of rogues and thieves, they became heroes.
In 1954, the Geneva Conference decided that fate. In a compromise decision, the conference divided Vietnam into 2 parts. In the north, it conceded Viet Minh communist control. In the south, it provided for free elections, for a free people who rejected communism. After 1954, the communist Viet Cong renewed their assault on South Vietnam in direct violation of the Geneva Conference's ceasefire agreement. Viet Cong tactics were closely patterned after those successfully practiced by the Chinese communists. Well-trained, well-equipped guerrillas, backed by political commissars and agitators, struck out. They terrorized the cities, sabotaged rails and transportation, blew up bridges, attacked the villages, and melted back into the jungle.
The French Foreign Legion was unlike any other 20th century military force in the world. An army of mercenaries whose sense of honor transcended national boundaries. These were the orphans of the French Republic and the spearhead of the Republic's armed response to the Vietnam uprising. Few military units pride themselves on battles that were ultimately lost. But for the men of the French Foreign Legion, pride and honor are more important than victory and defeat. This tradition was never more tested than at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. France was losing the war for Indochina. Since the defeat of Japan in 1945, French troops and colonial administrators attempted to reassert control of France's Asian empire. It proved to be a costly and futile exercise. For 8 years, France attempted to subdue the stubborn coalition of communist guerrillas and Vietnamese nationalists who vowed to expel all foreigners from their country. This was no war to win the hearts and minds of the people. It was a brutal war of attrition, a war perfectly suited to the Legion. In total, nearly 30,000 legionnaires were deployed, an army that was expected to quash the Asian rabble. The motto of the Legion was Legio Pasteria Nostra, the Legion is my father. The men's loyalty is to each other and to their officers for whom they march or die. And in Vietnam, they died by the thousands. In spite of their courage, the Legion's climactic battle for Southeast Asia at Dien Bien Phu is considered a classic example of how not to wage war. In November of 1953, France foolishly deployed the majority of its forces in a vast basin totally surrounded by jungle-clad hills held by the enemy Viet Minh. All winter, undetected by French commanders, preoccupied with minor ground skirmishes, the enemy advanced. The Viet Minh covered the hills with hundreds of cannons and tons of ordnance, carried on their backs up the steep slopes. To deliver the killing blow, tens of thousands of men infiltrated the hillside, placing the French base under constant rifle fire. From the beginning, the French lacked sufficient manpower and equipment to do more than hold on, yet the fighting dragged on through the spring of 1954.
The climactic struggle for Dien Bien Phu enters its second month with airborne reinforcements shuttled to the beleaguered garrison, where paratroopers drop to a fate that remains in the balance. The picked contingent hits the ground and goes into action immediately with machine gun and mortar fire. Operation Castor takes the pressure off the original defenders of the garrison, whose name has become military legend. Throwing air superiority into the struggle, all possible cover is provided before monsoon's ground plains. Outnumbered 4-1, they repulse attacks. Both sides fight to the last ditch for Dien Bien Phu.
As the climactic struggle for Dien Bien Phu entered its second month, airborne reinforcements were dropped into the beleaguered base. The para-legions hit the ground and went into action immediately through a never-ending hail of machine gun and mortar fire. The legionnaires, who had gladly volunteered to parachute into the battle, knew that there was no way out. No evacuation was possible, and by tradition, legionnaires never surrender. The men fought until there was no more ammunition, no more bodies to absorb the relentless shrapnel raining from the skies above. On May 8, 1954, the fortress fell. 8,000 legionnaires were dead. The fall of Dien Bien Phu marked the end of the French War and the beginning of America's longest conflict. The origins of America's commitment of ground troops to Indochina can be traced to a warm October day in 1961 in the first year of John Kennedy's brief presidency. President Kennedy had come to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, primarily to review the 82nd Airborne and to get a feel for the power of an American division with all its might and in all its glory. The young commander-in-chief also had another, more pressing reason for the visit to the base. He had also come to witness what the Army's newly created small elite fighting force could do. This force was the Army's Special Forces.
Now I'm down there standing at attention with the 82nd Airborne Division all out on Pope Air Force Base, and the President's driving by checking us out. Here's John Kennedy going by, and everybody's supposed to be staring straight ahead in the back of the head and in front of you, and everybody, the pride that we had for him. And I wrote and told my father, I said, Dad, I said, I'm not supposed to do it. You're supposed to be looking straight ahead. But I looked up, and Jack Kennedy's, we had eye contact. And to me, that was, oh, it couldn't get any better. 19 years old, and a kid that was almost in jail. Now I'm looking at the President of the United States.
It was a proud moment for a 19-year-old trooper and his Special Forces comrades. They wanted to demonstrate that pride with the headgear of their brotherhood. In the Army of the 50s and early 60s, distinctive uniforms for elite troops was strictly forbidden. But on the 12th of October, Green Berets of every variety were taken from their hiding places and placed on freshly shaved heads. On this day, for the first time at an official function, the Special Forces troops wore the cherished symbol of their brotherhood, the Green Beret.
These are guys who can put it together with good state of mind, and they're smart, and they're able to put the two together. And I think that's, yeah, it takes a special kind of guy.
From that day forward, the Army's Special Forces would be known by friend and foe alike by their distinctive headgear. It wasn't surprising that JFK would place his blessings upon the Maverick Special Operations Unit. To the young president, they were glamorous, and these were the most glamorous days of Camelot. But in addition to the glamour, Special Forces had the potential to do things that Kennedy wanted to accomplish. And those things were outlined in his inaugural speech in January of that year. His words were a call to arms for the free world.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
The Special Forces would be the spearhead to defend that vision of superpower foreign policy, a steel bolt to strike swiftly and silently on Third World battlefields where the Cold War was heating up. In the late 50s and early 60s, the Cold War was nowhere hotter than in Southeast Asia.
And in '61, Vietnam came online. And we were recruited, all of the aviators were recruited to go to Vietnam and fly for a segment of the government. The Army had not been inserted into Vietnam in 1961-62 timeframe. They were using military assets to fly for Air America on logistics missions and things like that.
To combat these forces, the U.S. needed to develop a new kind of warrior.
The officers need to understand. They need to go to school and understand the culture that they're within. They need to be able to recognize things that might not play well, the way you treat villages, the way you act. I mean, you may be thinking that you're being polite. You're really not. Those sort of things that the officers need to know. I don't think the enlisted men really do need to know that. From a Special Forces point of view, though, they do need to know that, and they do know that, and they did know that in Vietnam. That's all those famous pictures that I guess it was Life magazine did of Vernon Gillespie in 1962 and 63. You've probably seen them playing with the children of the Montagnards. This is the sort of things they were taught to do, and they did it very well. So Special Forces, and Special Forces still does that. That's why we have Special Forces groups that are devoted to one area.
The old concept of an SF warrior as fire-breathing commando had to be rethought. The new Special Forces warrior had to be politically and psychologically sensitive to the environment where he operates. But before you could create the perfect super soldier, you had to build the foundation of the fighting man. Jump and Ranger School became the 101 courses for building the warriors of special ops. The future warriors came to jump school for a variety of reasons. For some, like Larry Riley, it was a youthful impulse.
I was an 18-year-old kid, well, a 17-year-old kid at this time, and I wanted to be a paratrooper, okay? So this was, and there's not a lot of thought to it.
For others, it was a chance to get out of a messy situation.
I got in some trouble that summer of '60, and the officer that was talking to me knew my father, and he said, why don't you do something with your life, and you ever thought about the service? What was ironic is in basic training, it's all new and you're just a recruit. I was on mess hall duty in KP, and I heard the first sergeant out in the background in the company area saying anybody who was going airborne, fall out and do the airborne PT test. You still have to physically qualify for the airborne. So I said, Mess Sergeant, I'm supposed to be airborne. I'm going out there. Of course, I don't know if he knew. He probably thought I was trying to sandbag and get out of mess hall duty, but I'm missing my opportunity here. I'd already been rejected by the Navy because I was too mean, I guess. And then, anyway, he said, you're in the mess hall. He said, you can go airborne later. You're in my mess hall now. Keep washing them pans.
Since the dark days before America's entry into World War II, this was the toughest training any American fighting man could face.
Oh, jump school. It's hell, I'll say that. They talk about hell week in the Navy, but boy, every time your left foot hits the ground, you holler airborne, and everything's done at a double time, and they're trying to weed out who really doesn't have the heart to stay there.
Endless physical training, hard discipline, and the danger of jumping out of a perfectly good airplane. This was the furnace that tempered the steel that would be the sword of American foreign policy in the Third World.
Ranger! Port, ho, turn. Ranger! Port, ho, turn, ho, ho. 1, 2, 3, ho, ho. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Every day. Gotta run. Gotta run. Every day. Gotta run. Gotta run. Gotta be.
We throw things at you rather fast. You've got to react immediately. Because later on, if you don't react immediately, you will be a casualty. And you're doing us no good. We have to put you in an old pine box because you didn't use your noodle. You'll be exposed to pain and punishment and other little devices that we'll think of for one reason and one reason only. To make you the type of person we need to get the job done, no matter what the job is.
The Special Forces training process began in what is called the Q course, held at the Smoke Bomb Hill area of Fort Bragg. The Q course is a mixture of classroom training and field activity with the weight on field. The basic unit in Special Forces is the A-Team. There are only 12 people in an A-Team.
Generally in an A-Team, you would have a demolitions guy, you would have a communications guy, you would have a language guy, you have a medic, who's almost the equivalent of a doctor, a medic that could perform surgery. At Fort Bragg, there's a great demonstration of some of the skills of Special Forces, and I'd be impressed. Not every member of Special Forces can do what the next guy can do. You're cross-trained. You're always cross-trained. But I mean, there are guys who could just break into anything. They could take a padlock and tap it with their fingernail and it'd fall open.
Each member of the team is cross-trained in a number of jobs vital to completing the team's mission many miles behind enemy lines. Among the team, there is no discrimination because of rank. If your mission falls into one of your specialties, you are in charge.
I remember, well, basic training, like sergeant's the sergeant, and the officers are like, they're way up there, like all you do with officers is salute, stand at attention, and say yes, sir. But then when you got into group, there was a mutual respect for ability and talent. I use the word talent because they did find in each individual something that you really know how to do. And they put that to work. And the officers showed a lot of respect to the enlisted men, so the enlisted men, obviously. And in combat, you know something? It really doesn't matter what rank you are. If you're a jerk, you can be fragged. It doesn't matter how many stars you have on your shoulder. If you're mistreating other guys, the chances are good that someone will consider, I'm not going to let this guy pick on me. But there's a lot of respect for officers because they knew what they were doing, and they knew that we knew how to do what we were supposed to do.
In the Vietnam-era A-Team, each soldier had to be an expert marksman with the basic weapon of the U.S. infantry, his M16, and with any enemy weapon he may encounter on the battlefield. He had to not only know how to fire them, but also how to maintain, modify, and repair each weapon.
They were given special training, superpowers, you might say. Knowledge is power.
After a week of primary instruction, the teams moved into the field for 2 weeks of hands-on training. The A-teams would form up to deploy in enemy country. The teams were expected to contact indigenous people and turn them into guerrillas. These were usually played by soldiers of support units from Fort Bragg who dressed as civilians. They would then take these units to blow up bridges and communication centers, as well as set up ambushes and develop civil affairs work aimed at winning the hearts and minds of the people.
Under ambush, the riflemen start shooting, whether you're on foot or in a truck, deuce and a half or a 3/4-ton truck. The riflemen start shooting at you. So the natural tendency is to jump for cover to the other side, maybe into a buffalo hole where they used to waller, you know, to cool off a little bit, a water buffalo. And as soon as you do that, then the machine gun is on you. So the only option really is to go for the live fire. You go directly into the rifleman. It's almost generally a no-win situation. So that was in preparation for the types of ambushes that we would experience. But we, because of the guerrilla operations, rarely experienced ambushes except in long-distance travel.
Better to get killed at Bragg than get killed for keeps in Nam. Soldiers who completed this successfully were rewarded with the cherished flash on their green beret.
These were badasses. You know, look, they're not all 300-pound guys who look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, you know, a lot of brains in special forces. And a lot of times on an A-team, although you do have, you have to meet certain physical requirements, a lot of it is brains over brawn.
It was now time to put all that training to the test.
My darling Mick, today has been another long day at Mang Su, Laos, but at least it's ended and I'm that much closer to being with you and Robin once again. You know, I actually enjoy this tour of duty so long as I'm busy enough to keep my thoughts from wandering back to you. Our mission's classified, but I do think we are making a difference. Captain Joe Bush, Advisor to Laotian Forces, Mang Su, Laos.
Special Forces had a long history in Southeast Asia. In July of 1959, 12 U.S. Special Forces teams from the 77th Special Group were sent to Laos to clandestinely organize and train the Laotian Army. The Green Berets arrived in the country wearing civilian clothes with fake identification and were paid out of civilian funds from CIA bank accounts. In addition to training, these teams also had to find a way to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that ran through Laos into South Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not a single route south, but a spiderweb of trails and footpaths that communist forces used to supply cadres throughout Southeast Asia. By 1961, the political situation in Laos had reached a boiling point. Fighting between communist insurgents, competing warlords and ethnic struggles, with their roots going back generations, coups and counter-coups were beginning to unhinge American foreign policy in Southeast Asia. According to the domino theory, President Kennedy had to do something about Laos. Early in 1961, U.S. Special Forces were officially admitted into Laos. They could wear their uniforms and were designated by U.S. Military Assistance Advisory Group Laos, or MAG Laos, as White Star mobile training teams.
Special Forces were sent to Laos as part of an operation called White Star. And I think that that's probably where they got the early lessons learned, if you will, for what they would become their role in Vietnam. The first groups that went in were under civilian cover, and they were just supposed to look around and see what they found. They found the obvious, which was that the communists were all over the country, that there was going to be a real problem, and the Special Forces then went in as part of Kennedy administration's military commitment to Laos. There's still a limited amount of Special Forces that went in as trainers, and the sort of things that became the rule in Vietnam.
These new teams were the spearhead of the thousands of troops to be sucked into Vietnam. The mission of these White Star teams was to instruct Laotian troops in counterinsurgent tactics. But not all activity was limited to the classroom. Some of the teams provided in-the-field assistance in the form of communication services, gathering of intelligence, and creating strike forces among the minority hill people of Laos. It was with this last mission that the White Star teams made their lasting contribution. In late 1961, the Pathet Lao controlled the strategic Balovan Plateau in southern Laos. Ka Hill people mostly inhabited this area in the Laotian Panhandle region. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran between the plateau and the Vietnamese border. The mission of the Green Beret was to organize, arm, and train the Ka tribesmen into guerrilla bands that could drive the Pathet Lao off the plateau and cut the trail. The Special Forces advisors often found themselves in the middle of some of the most desperate fighting in all of the war. These desperate fights were the first trial by fire of the young berets. They also etched the first names into the black granite wall that would become the stark symbol of America's sacrifice in Southeast Asia.
Dear Mick, only 2.5 more months to go. From all that's happening in Little Laos, it seems that I will keep quite busy. It looks like I will have 6 new ribbons on my uniform when I come home. All of that's classified, but if all of the paperwork gets completed, I will receive a little recognition for a generally thankless job. They want me to extend my tour, but baby, I have to get out of this place. Don't worry, old Joseph will be home to his wife and daughter as planned, even if I have to swim the Pacific. Your own, Joe.
Captain Joseph Kerr Bush, Jr., military advisor to Laotian forces, was killed 5 days later during an NVA commando attack. He was 25 years old. The Special Forces advisors did save the villages from a communist takeover, but failed through no fault of their own to sever the communist supply trails. The attacks on the trail itself were never accomplished.
Again, there were 2 wars going on, and the center of gravity for the main force war is the base areas. And in any war situation, you have to go for the center of gravity. We didn't do it. Center of gravity for the insurgency is the infrastructure. We waited too long to go after it. If we'd done those 2 things early on, it would have been a much different war than it turned out to be.
By 1962, the U.S. reached an agreement with the communists to stabilize the situation in Laos. This agreement ended any hope of cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail and gave free access to supplies to communist forces in the South for the next decade. Supplies that would be used to end the lives of over 55,000 young Americans.
Dear Dad, I'm writing this letter to you at your office because I want you to tell Mom in your own words. I don't think writing home would get anything straight. Well, here it is. We've been told that our whole company will be shipping to Vietnam. The only thing that makes me mad is how do they expect you to tell your parents? They act as though it's an everyday experience and that we should feel the same way. Robert Devon, 71st Infantry Detachment.
By 1960, Viet Cong insurgency in South Vietnam began to grow at an increasing rate. The Viet Cong were battle-hardened veterans. Some had fought this type of war on the same ground against both the Japanese and later the French colonial army. For U.S. forces, this was going to be a very different war from the one they spent a decade training for.
We were now in Vietnam. It was a counterinsurgency. The enemy was hidden. The enemy didn't fight from fixed installations. The enemy didn't wear uniforms. The enemy fought at night. The American forces didn't fight at night. All of the things that we had been taught about fighting an enemy that was on a European battlefield, particularly for an armor officer, it didn't work in Vietnam.
But there was one group of U.S. warriors ready for the coming fight.
Part of the groundswell within the Kennedy administration is over this new notion of counterinsurgency. And the obvious choice for counterinsurgency are warriors who are sort of like the insurgents themselves. In this case, it's the Green Berets, the Special Forces. So there's a very public push in 1960, mostly beginning, within the Kennedy administration to send Special Forces to Vietnam to fight the guerrilla as a guerrilla, if you will. And the perception of the war began to change with the reality on the ground, which in this case was, this is a fairly, 1960, a low-level guerrilla war with insurgents that are very much able to stay away from the main force, South Vietnamese units, and do a lot of damage and gain a lot of support within the countryside. Special forces were seen as a way to try to get to thwart that. And the idea was, exactly as they had been planned in Europe, to send them behind enemy lines, in this case just into the countryside in Vietnam, and to try to garner support for the government by living with the people, offering programs that would make their lives better, and at the same time training them to defend themselves.
Just months after President Kennedy's visit to Fort Bragg, the Special Forces was in Vietnam to implement a CIA plan to stem the Viet Cong tide in the central highlands of Vietnam. The program was called Civilian Irregular Defense Group, CIDG program.
We had 200 officers were in the class, and we had about 30 who had been in Vietnam in '64 as advisors. And they really were starting to rewrite all of the lesson material. We would have these officers, these returnees, would stand up and talk to us. So that it was because everybody was going to go to Vietnam in '66. Anybody that hadn't been was going to go. So as an aviator, I knew I would go over and fly, and so it was very important that we learned as much as we could from these fellas that had returned about life in Vietnam. There were no books.
The goal of this operation was to deny the VC access to food, supplies, recruits, and intelligence. They hoped to block the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, access to Vietnam from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was the rejected agency proposal from Laos. The highlands were inhabited primarily by an assortment of minority groups and primitive tribes, collectively called Montagnards, mountain people. The Vietnamese people thought they were savages and held the Montagnards in great contempt. This distrust would hinder counterinsurgency in the highlands, which is exactly what the CIA intended to do.
In the beginning, I think, is the early 60s, part of the mission of the Green Berets was, to go to the hills, to meet with these tribes, and to try to convince them to support the government of South Vietnam. But as you approach the Montagnards and you talk to them about the government, they would say, what government? You mean that guy who comes and steals my water buffalo? Taxes. The Montagnards had seen too much of it, the VC running through. And they were largely, like so many people in Vietnam, victimized by the VC run through, and if you don't give us rice, if you don't let us use your facilities, what facility? Basically water, food and water, then you're our enemy. Well, then the RVNs come in, the South Vietnamese army comes in and sees that, and even the American army comes in and sees that, and they're suddenly guilty of harboring the enemy. They didn't harbor the enemy. Same thing we learned later in years in El Salvador and in Central America. The peasants were victimized by the war like that. But the Montagnards were especially strong people.
The CIDG program was run by the CIA and American Special Forces and was loosely connected to the Strategic Hamlet program. Although the program was conceived and funded by the CIA, the strategy and operation fell to the Green Beret. In November of 1961, 2 Special Forces A-teams were deployed from the 1st Special Forces Group. The A-team established a base in an area and began to win the trust of the local villagers. They then helped them prepare a defense system against the local Cong Cadre and NVA forces. The Green Berets also recruited and trained local men to form a strike force designed to provide a full-time offensive force. This force would provide reinforcements to area villages under attack, patrol trails in the area, and set ambushes for the VC. Once the SF had established an effective strike force, they would begin to organize and train village defenses. These groups received basic training in weapons handling and were taught to defend and fortify their homes. They fought only when their village was under attack. Each village was provided with a radio that allowed them to contact the Green Berets and the local strike force. The strategy was simple, the results remarkable, and the heroism of both the Green Berets and the mountain people unmatched. The degree of the heroism was demonstrated in places like Pleiku.
And they held out. They held out. But I think the guys at Pleiku saw it the worst.
The Special Forces had established a base of operations near a strategic branch of the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
I think that was the ultimate goal, was to try to get in there and probably within 4 to 5 months have something in there, like a fixed fire base or a road or something. Well, we continued to gather intelligence, and we continued to get shot at.
The U.S. troops and their yard strike force were determined to cut this enemy supply line. The VC and the NVA were just as determined not to let this happen.
They had discipline, they wore uniforms, they would stand and fight.
The Viet Cong and NVA regulars assaulted the Green Beret fire base with a fury unseen to date in the war. This was no longer guerrilla warfare. It was an old-fashioned siege.
89 days. And they were just swamped by swarms.
The small strike force called in every asset they had.
Roger, that's the target area there.
It was tough because we didn't do a lot of fighting at night, and they did. We would hunker in. We would go into defensive posture at night. We would ring in. We would tighten, gather the wagons. We would try to do the best we could, send out listening, posts, devices, you know, be within earshot, do all this kind of stuff, flares, but no great assaults. We reacted. We weren't trained to fight at night, but they did. They were unstructured, and they did a hell of a job, and they would infiltrate, and they would get into our britches and in our face, unseen and unsighted and unsmelled, and blow our buns off.
And when bad weather grounded their air support, they called on sheer guts alone to hold out.
So we're working with the Montagnards. They ran out of ammunition. And they're throwing rocks. They're throwing anything they could find. If there was a coat hanger on the ground, it got put to use. And they held out. They held out. That was nasty. But you're talking like, I can recall, I don't believe I slept for 2 months one time, if that's possible. I mean, I did lie down, hugging my weapon all the time. But if you can sleep with one eye open, I did it.
It's just the idea when you see what I saw and all of these soldiers fighting gallantly. I mean, I don't want to get overly excited and teary, but these were kids. But it was a tough time. It was tough for everybody.
Bloody and battered, the Green Beret and their yard strike forces held out and broke the back of the assaulting Kong. The success of the A-teams was so extraordinary that by April 1962, 40 villages in Darlak province were under the protection of the CIDG program. By May 1962, 8 more teams were ordered to Vietnam. By July, the CIA was so pleased with the success that the agency requested 16 more teams for deployment. But if the agency was pleased, the communists were not. They feared and respected the Special Forces warriors so much that they even resorted to offering bounties to villagers and guerrilla fighters to stop the berets. You didn't even have to turn in a whole American.
We compared it to a $10,000 bounty. If you bring me the head of a Green Beret, you get $10,000. So there was that constant concern about not losing your head.
Overall, the CIDG program was operating very well. In just 1 year, the Special Forces and their Montagnards forces had denied the Viet Cong access to the local population and the resources of food and shelter. But sometimes, the enemy was closer than you expected.
Up around Pleiku, I had some buddies who were sitting there. They weren't Special Forces. They were Signal Corps. They were to build a communications tower. And they were on TDY, temporary duty. And there about 4 months. And for 4 months, there was a Vietnamese lady in the camp who would wash their clothes, cook them special foods, bring them special favors. And when they left, when they were to return to wherever their base was outside of Vietnam, they were in the back of a 3/4-ton truck, and as they pulled away, she came running up to them with a gift. And she handed them the gift, and it was a grenade, and it went off. And so this is after like months of Monosan being the one to take care of you, make your coffee. So they were in place. They were in place for a long time, and they were everywhere. And identifying them was literally impossible. Even in camps where it was considered secure, they generally knew that among some of the nationals, some of those nationals were VC.
Sadly, the powers in Washington could not stand their own success. They were about to order a change to special operations in Vietnam that would alter the Shadow Warriors' mission and the nature of the war. The United States entered the Vietnam War in earnest in 1964 after a controversial incident in the Gulf of Tonkin. The incident was an attack on an American destroyer, the Maddox, by North Vietnamese PT boats. The outrage and the alleged attack 2 days later on the Turner Joy provoked the U.S. Congress to give President Johnson a free hand in running the war. What no one in the administration explained to Congress was that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was not an unprovoked act. In fact, the American ship was placed off the coast of North Vietnam specifically to be attacked. Once in place, the ship simulated the radio traffic that would take place, leading up to an air assault against North Vietnamese ports. The not unforeseeable counterattack became Lyndon Johnson's cover story. Without it, he would have had to pay a too heavy political price for his buildup in Vietnam. The Johnson administration was made up of advisors collectively known as the Whiz Kids, holdovers from the Kennedy White House. They were statisticians and efficiency experts, confident that if the United States could just maintain a certain pace in the war, the enemy would eventually concede defeat. These guys were number crunchers, and they worked for a president who revered politics above everything. As Congress and the public grew concerned about American involvement in Vietnam, Johnson promised to limit American involvement in the war. In reality, he had no intention of doing that, and buried the truth in a flurry of statistics. That numbers game was to have a tragic effect on the air war in Vietnam. Johnson did cut the number of American aircraft in Vietnam, but he did it by deploying aircraft to bases off Vietnamese soil in Thailand or Guam, within range of Vietnam. That meant flight crews arriving over drop sites were exhausted from long flights, and that the enemy force they were sent to intercept had long since moved on through the jungle. Militarily, stationing aircraft so far from the battlefield was a bad decision. Numerically, however, it made perfect sense. What was important to the whiz kids back in Washington wasn't the real military effect of the mission. What they cared about was the number of planes on the ground and the tonnage of bombs dropped from the sky. In effect, the numbers became the reality. Unlike World War II, where the enemy's strength was concentrated in the major cities and in vast industrial complexes, in Vietnam, the communist strength was concentrated in the rural areas. It was there that the anti-Saigon government feeling ran the deepest, but the countryside was also where the American strategy of bombing the Vietnamese into submission had the least effect. In Vietnam, with an economy based on subsistence farming and a decentralized enemy, it would be hard to imagine a less effective weapon than massive air power. General Curtis LeMay had promised to bomb the North into the Stone Age, but that boast was lost on a foe whose society had barely progressed beyond the Stone Age. The air war in Nam was called Rolling Thunder. It was a two-tiered approach to air war. Closest to the fighting on the ground were the smaller aircraft, the F-1s, O-5s, and the 104s. They worked down low and fast, doing the job that in earlier wars would have been done by artillery. When troops on the ground engaged the enemy, they called in an air response and got the hell out of the area. The fast movers would then come in, hauling napalm, and burn everything within a mile of the drop coordinates, including the enemy. The second tier was the B-52s, flying in from Guam and Thailand, each dropping 30 tons of bombs. One B-52 flying alone could wipe out an area the size of 10 football fields, and the U.S. Air Force sent waves. The air war changed forever when the North Vietnamese started taking delivery of Russian surface-to-air missiles. The SAMs were installed to protect North Vietnamese cities from American bombers, making Hanoi the North Vietnamese capital, the most heavily defended city in the world. As the Soviets moved anti-aircraft missiles into the north, Washington sent word to the air crews that the launch sites were not to be bombed while under construction because the Russian technicians were building the batteries. The White House feared the repercussions should Soviet technicians be killed. For months, American aircraft would fly over undefended SAM sites, watching the construction, and then be ordered back to attack those exact sites when the enemy was able to shoot back. The losses were staggering. To counter the SAMs, Air Force commanders came up with one of the most harebrained and successful tactics: the wild weasels. The wild weasels were pilots flying F-105s and later F-104s who would fly ahead of the main flight, painting himself on the enemy radar and hanging around in the kill zone of the SAMs long enough for the ground battery to take a shot at him. Once the Vietnamese lit up their radar, the sites were easy to find and destroy. It did not take long for the North Vietnamese to recognize the tactic, but it still left them with no good way to respond. The weasels would strike hard and fast to remove the fangs from the enemy's air defense. As the size and effectiveness of the CIDG continued to grow, the Joint Chiefs began to doubt that the CIA had the personnel and resources to manage all the Special Forces troops now in the country. As the Special Forces operations continued to win hearts and minds, Washington made a fatal decision. They switched tactical command of Green Beret operations from the CIA to MAC-V. Once MAC-V had command of the CIDG program, the mission began to change. For both the SF troops and the local strike force, the change was for the worse. MAC-V understood neither the nature of special operations nor the requirements of counterinsurgency. From the beginning, MAC-V viewed the Berets' involvement in the CIDG program as too static.
Well, in '64 actually is when it begins. There's a decision to use Special Forces as a long-range reconnaissance function, and it takes two basic forms. The first form is the Greek teams, if you will, the Sigma and Omega teams, which are rather large, fairly large groups of 25 Special Forces with hatchet teams to back them up, which were indigenous SIGIs. It could be as large as 100. And what they would do is they would go into enemy base areas inside South Vietnam, usually on reconnaissance missions, but they were big enough that they could handle any trouble. And if they needed, they could call on air support artillery or these hatchet teams to back them up. And they did that a lot, particularly in the southern Central Highlands and in the Three Corps region, well west of Saigon, over on the Cambodian border. And then also in '64, there is the formations of the Studies and Observations Group, which is SOG, which becomes quite famous. It's the covert arm, cross-border arm of SOG. Most basically, there are other forces, other services involved in it, but it's mostly Special Forces. And what SOG is a political realization that the prohibition against American operations in Laos and Cambodia and North Vietnam is counterproductive. You just can't fight a war that way. Normally, you would have sent reconnaissance elements, big reconnaissance elements, in an overt way into the base areas in Laos, and then you would have invaded them if you found the army, but that's off limits, so SOG has to do that. So it's a covert operation. Special Forces with very large limitations on them are allowed in certain areas of Laos to start out with, and Cambodia later on. Laos beginning in '65, Cambodia beginning in '66, to search out the base areas, get intelligence, and call in airstrikes.
As a result, the Green Berets were removed from the role of administering the CIDG program and reassigned to providing surveillance along the Cambodian and Laotian borders. Now, the Shadow Warriors would conduct offensive missions against the belly of the beast, Viet Cong support bases.
Well, we were playing in their backyard. Basically, the VC, Viet Cong, who were South Vietnamese fighting against the Vietnamese, we were basically going into their territory and saying, we can play this game too.
By 1965, U.S. ground forces were pouring into Vietnam, and the newly established 5th Special Forces Group was actively taking action against Viet Cong infiltration routes. The standing order was to find, fix, and destroy the enemy forces where they live. The team was flown in by unmarked Hueys that would touch down on a number of clearings before the A-team would jump out and head for cover on the run. Bob Wessel was the door gunner.
We were flying a Special Forces group into Cambodia. This was a CIA presidential decision. It was made. We were going over in unmarked helicopters and unmarked uniforms.
There was good reason for the unmarked Huey. At the time, the U.S. government was still claiming that they would not violate the neutrality of Cambodia.
Of course, we weren't in Cambodia at the time. And that particular day, that morning, we flew out and dropped off 3 Americans and 8 Cambodian mercenaries. And their mission was they were along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They were supposed to watch the NVA movement coming down the trail, unmarked trails, and their basic mission was to capture an enemy truck and bring it back.
No sooner did Wessel and his crew fly out of sight when all hell broke loose for the strike force. As the Berets and their cadre fought for their lives, the air crews picked up their radio messages.
It was about lunchtime. We was eating our lunch, and we was monitoring them on the radio and the helicopter, and they caught hell. They got surrounded. There was a helicopter before us. It was supposed to be first extraction helicopter. Well, he was monitoring the same thing, and his battery went dead, so he couldn't fire his up. So we were second helicopter for extraction. It was Chief Warrant Officer Bill Armstrong. Co-pilot was James Fusel. And there was Gary Land as the other door gunner, and myself. And we had a James Calvary, Special Forces medic on a helicopter. So we were one to go and extract them. I can remember flying towards the area, and about treetop level, I was looking down. I could see, looked like there was columns of NVA moving in that area. I mean, we could see them moving in, which is, there's some butt kickers. The NVA, they're regular Army, they're good. But I remember going in, and it was an area where it was a lot of trees. We had to hover and drop straight down into the area.
The Special Forces team was now in a running firefight, desperately trying to make it to the nearest landing zone and the safety of extraction.
So we had landed, and we had moved away from the LZ and basically set up a perimeter, and just wanted to see if we were being followed. We saw another team across the valley being infiltrated. We could see them. They were about 5 miles away, and we sat there and we watched the gunships come in. We saw the choppers try to go in and get them out, and we also listened to it on the radio. And that was a very difficult time for us.
The choppers were burning up the turbos, trying to get there in time.
As we dropped down in the air, we just started catching fire going in. Matter of fact, they shut all our radio equipment out. It was gone. So we had no communication with the CNC ship up above. So we were basically on our own. And I can remember landing, and there was this fire going on. I could hear Gary firing on the other side, and I was firing.
As the Green Berets and the surviving Cambodians reached the LZ and the choppers, the NVA turned their fury on the rescuing slicks and the air crews.
We had a lot of incoming rounds, and I remember sitting there firing. I had a bunch of them coming toward me, like 15, 20 of them I fired, and they all went down. They never came back up. About that time, I thought I heard Gary quit firing, or I heard him yell on the other side, and I turned my head to look, and when I turned my head, I got hit 3 times in the chest and once through the neck. And probably by him yelling or something on the other side, probably saying he probably shot me right through the throat. But I didn't pass out, lucky enough, because what happened was I had so much blood on my glasses I couldn't see. So, of course, I had to take the time to clean my glasses off and get my back together again.
As Wessel cleaned his glasses, the battered team piled into the waiting choppers. The undamaged Hueys lifted off. Wessel and his crew members were the only living Americans still on the ground. It was at that moment that something strange occurred. The fire on the left and right sides facing the deadly M16 machine guns of Wessel and Land slackened.
About the time I got done cleaning them, they figured out, I guess, they couldn't come through the sides, so they started coming up behind the helicopter. Of course, the R-60s were mounted, and you couldn't turn them that far. So I grabbed the M16 and started to get out and spray the area. About that time, I could feel the helicopter starting to move. At the same time, I seen Mr. Armstrong's heads go down, and kind of scary. I didn't know what happened to him.
As the Huey Slick tried to stay airborne, Wessel looked around at the interior of the damaged ship.
There he landed. I could see him laying on the floor, part of him laying on the floor. And the Special Forces guy in the helicopter, he had been shot. He'd got shot through the elbow and came out his shoulder. And I found out later on Gary Land had been shot through the leg, and some of his toes had been shot off. And the only reason he quit firing was they'd shot his ammo off to 60. And I remember we starting to fly out of there, and Mr. Calvary, the medic, asked if I wanted a shot of morphine, which I wasn't in no pain.
Even though they were in the air, the danger was far from over for the air crew and their SF passengers.
I remember starting to fly out and still firing all the way out. And I remember we was cutting down. We probably went about 100 yards just cutting treetops out, trying to get out of there. And I remember about halfway back, I seen Mr. Armstrong. He came back around and flew the helicopter back.
Life had become more dangerous for the warriors. As they took on a mission they knew they were not designed to handle. The A-teams, small in size and equipped for rapid movement, did not carry enough firepower to fight running battles with trained and heavily armed NVA and Trail Guard regiments. By 1965, in spite of the best efforts of the SF A-teams and the strike forces, the situation in Vietnam worsened. By the end of January, the Viet Cong were conducting large-scale operations, less than 50 miles from Saigon. To counter that threat, U.S. forces were about to meet the enemy face-to-face in strength for the first time. In the early years of the U.S. military's involvement in Vietnam, before American troops were fully committed to the fight against the falling dominoes of communism in Southeast Asia, the Army's top brass were haunted by what had happened to the last great colonial power there. Long before they were overwhelmed and forced to surrender at Dien Bien Phu, the French Army had been outmaneuvered and outfought by General Vo Nguyen Giap's Viet Minh. Hiding in the jungles and staying on the move, the Viet Minh harassed and decimated the larger, slower, less mobile French forces. They had an almost supernatural ability to appear out of nowhere, strike quickly and hard, and disappear into the countryside again. The American war planners knew that, like the French, they would find their superior technology and strength reduced, if not canceled out altogether, by the thick jungle, with only a few narrow, twisting roads. The unlikely answer came from the Army's experience in Korea. There, the helicopter had proven a quick and reliable way to transport wounded out of combat areas. Its speed and maneuverability suggested a new kind of use for a new kind of war. In 1962, the Army began training its 11th Air Assault Test Division at Fort Benning, Georgia, the same proving ground where it had developed its airborne infantry capability for World War II. For more than 2 years, the new cavalry practiced its art. The quick insertion of assault forces, weapons, and equipment at predetermined landing zones, or LZs, coordinated with artillery and tactical air support in precisely timed movements. In the summer of 1965, the U.S. Army 1st Cavalry Air Mobile was deployed to Vietnam. Their first base camp was at An Key in Central Highlands, in the 2 Corps command zone. They would not have long to wait for the first test of the Air Mobile doctrine. In October 1965, a regiment of the People's Army of North Vietnam, operating in the jungle-covered mountains of Pleiku Province near Vietnam's border with Cambodia, attacked the U.S. Special Forces camp at Plei My, not far from An Key. Seemingly out of nowhere, in a surprise action reminiscent of the NVA's successful campaign against the French, the enemy emerged from the jungle en masse and laid siege to Plei My. When a nearby unit of South Vietnamese regulars moved in to help the Americans, the NVA ambushed them. It was time for the U.S. cavalry to ride to the rescue. It was time for Air Mobile. The air cav swept into the area where the South Vietnamese units were under attack, using large CH-46 and 47 helicopters to deploy 105mm howitzers to landing zones within range of the communist positions. From there, the howitzers pounded the communist forces, allowing the South Vietnamese to escape and continue on to Plei My. At the same time, the air cav was moving its artillery into place near Plei My. Hours of heavy and deadly accurate shelling forced the Vietnamese regiment to give up the siege and retreat westward, back toward the Cambodian jungle.
We was firing at zero point blank, right? And I fired, I never forget this, I fired 143 rounds direct fire. We was shooting them as close as we could. I know when the infantry made their sweep to go out and see how many North Vietnamese had been killed, first shell we fired, we assumed it was the first one. It's hard to tell, but the first one we fired had killed 19 North Vietnamese in a trench. And they had something like 40-some RPGs, the rockets. Can you imagine if we hadn't got them on? And we assumed it was on the first round because they had not one rocket had been fired from that group. So we assumed the first shell we fired got them. And we felt that that was something that probably saved a lot of lives. I honestly can say that, and everybody in my old unit, they can say it too. I had the best gun crew in Vietnam. Actually, I had the best gun crew in the Army.
The U.S. command immediately ordered Major General Harry W.O. Kennard, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile, to pursue and destroy the enemy. The Army had intelligence reports that at least one full regiment of communist troops, and possibly 2, was deployed in the Central Highlands and preparing a major offensive there. Kennard sent the 1st Brigade, 7th Cavalry, into the wilderness west of Plei My in pursuit of the retreating North Vietnamese. Unable to see their enemy through the thick canopy of the rainforest, the 1st of the 7th moved west toward the Ai Drang River Valley and the forbidding Chu Pong Massif. As they went, they employed a technique called reconnaissance by fire. Cruising above the treetops, out of the range of small arms fire, helicopter gunships fired into the dense growth, flushing and then reducing enemy units more or less at random as they waited for the chance to deliver the killing blow. But this was Vietnam, and the enemy was not about to be so easily eliminated, and had plans to deliver a killing blow of its own. In October 1965, elements of the U.S. Army's 1st Air Cavalry had repulsed a massive attack by North Vietnamese Army regulars on the American Special Forces camp at Plei Mi in the central highlands of Vietnam. Now, in mid-November, under orders from the Air Cav commander, Major General Harry Kennard, the 3rd Brigade of the 7th Cavalry, the storied Gary Owen Brigade, had taken up the Air Cav's search and destroy mission to find and finish off what remained of the NVA forces that had attacked Plei Mi. Colonel Thomas W. Brown, commander of the Gary Owen Brigade, assigned Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore and his 450-man 1st Battalion 7th Cavalry to make an air mobile insertion into the valley of the Ai Drang River. The location was about 20 miles west of Plei Mi, at the foot of the Chu Pong Mountains, and General Kennard and Colonel Brown thought it was the most likely place to find the communist regulars. On November 14, 1965, after making 2 reconnaissance overflights of the target area and identifying several possible landing zones, LZs, Moore selected LZ X-Ray, a wide, irregularly shaped clearing between 2 dry ravines, overgrown with elephant grass. Just after 10 in the morning, Moore's supporting artillery laid down a heavy barrage in the area of the LZ X-Ray. At 10:48 a.m., Moore's were the first boots on the ground as the 16 Air Cav Hueys delivered 2 platoons of his B Company to the landing zone. As Moore set up his command post, 2 platoons moved into position at the perimeter of the LZ on what would become the assault force's right flank. Half an hour later, choppers brought in a 3rd platoon of B Company and one of A Company. The B platoon immediately moved out to the perimeter, taking up a reconnaissance position to the left of the first 2 platoons. The A Company platoon set up in the center of the LZ to act as security for the landings. Without knowing it, Moore and his men had landed at the doorstep of 2 full communist infantry regiments, the 66th and the 69th. The enemy, through massive reinforcements through the jungle to the other side of the LZ, attempted to flank the badly outnumbered Americans. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the 3 platoons of B Company were battling for their lives in an intense and confusing firefight on the right flank. Moore ordered his reserves into the fight as a flight of choppers brought in 3 platoons from C Company to stop the flanking maneuver and shore up the American left. With fresh troopers on the ground, Moore ordered his units to form 2 cohesive lines along the west and south of the LZ and move into the tree line to extend the perimeter and secure the landing zone for future airlifts. As the firefight escalated, Moore learned that 3rd Platoon, B Company, had pushed too far out into the jungle on the right flank and had been cut off from the rest of the American forces. Surrounded and taking fire from 3 sides, the 29-man unit was holding on for dear life against more than 200 North Vietnamese. As the afternoon wore on, the NVA escalated their attack on the American positions, determined to overrun them and wipe them out. Moore called in heavy air support from B-52 bombers operating in the 2-corps zone to plaster the jungle around his position as the Air Cav's artillery support units continued to pour in fire from nearby landing zone Falcon. but the air and artillery support were not as effective as they might have been. The NVA had learned in their war against the French that if they fought in close proximity to their enemy, a strategy they called clinging to the belt, the enemy could not use its air cover and artillery to full effect without killing great numbers of its own men. The Huey pilots braved withering ground fire to make 3 more lifts, bringing in additional rifle platoons from companies C and D, heavy weapons, and LRP units. At around 5 in the afternoon, the enemies rushed the center of the Cavs line, nearly breaking through, but were driven back by a fresh platoon from Company D. Time and time again, they pressed the outnumbered American troops. As night fell on the Ai Drang Valley, both sides pulled back and prepared to pass an uneasy night. Neither knew what the dawn would bring. At dawn on November 15, 1965, 13 platoons from rifle companies A, B, C, and D of the 1st and 2nd Battalions, U.S. 7th Cavalry, part of the Army's new 1st Cavalry Air Mobile, waited anxiously for the rising of the sun. They were dug in along the western and southern perimeters of a jungle clearing in the valley of the Ai Drang River in the Vietnamese Central Highlands province of Pleiku. In the dark jungle that lay between them and the 2,300-foot Chupong Massif, which separated Vietnam from Cambodia, 2 full infantry regiments of the People's Army of Vietnam were hunkered down and preparing to attack. The Americans knew the attack would come. They knew also that the enemy outnumbered them, perhaps by as much as 5 to 1. The 2 sides had exchanged heavy fire at close range for almost 11 hours on the previous day. Thousands of communist regulars lay dead, but they had kept coming with increasing savagery. At 6:30 in the morning, the communists launched another savage attack. A combined force of the 7th Battalion, 66th Regiment, and the main force Viet Cong launched a massive assault against the American left flank. Their attack was fast, deadly, and overwhelming. In less than 30 minutes, many of the American units were scattered. The fighting in the center of the line was hand to hand. At 700 hours, Moore instructed his radio men to send an urgent message to all American units operating in the zone. Broken Arrow. Broken Arrow means an American unit is under siege and in grave danger of being overrun. Within minutes, every American plane and artillery unit within range of the call answered, raining death on the horrified NVA in a spectacular display of firepower. At a little after 9 o'clock, the communists had been driven back. and LZ X-Ray was re-secured, Huey's brought in fresh troops from the 7th Cavalry 2nd Battalion to shore up the badly sagging American lines. Throughout the afternoon, 2nd Platoon B Company was cut off from the main force and taking fire from all sides. Finally, at 4:30 in the afternoon, with dusk approaching, Moore ordered companies A and B to move against the NVA on the right flank to try and rescue the lost platoon. After advancing only 100 meters against heavy resistance, Moore called for white phosphorus artillery to be dropped in the area between the Communists and the lost platoon. While the phosphorus burned, the enemy took cover, breaking the rain of fire long enough for A Company to reach and bring back the battered platoon along with its dead and wounded. An hour later, the Communist commander pulled his troops back from the LZ X-Ray to regroup in the jungle. At noon, Hueys and larger CH-46 and CH-47s began bringing in replacements for the hardest hit units. The battle was over. Landing Zone X-Ray was secured for the night. The Battle of Ai Drang was the first full-scale military engagement between the American and North Vietnamese armies. Lieutenant Colonel Moore and his men accomplished their objectives. They found and reduced the enemy force that had attacked the Special Forces camp at Plei Mi and drove it from the Pleiku province, killing more than 1,200 communist troops in the process. At Ai Drang, the Gary Owen Brigade proved that the air cav would be an effective and resilient fighting force, well suited for this new kind of warfare. But the cost was high. In just 2 days of battle, the Gary Owen Brigade lost almost 300 men. It was one of America's greatest battles,